right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Rosendahl. I'm a park naturalist here at Gulf Branch Nature Center. I want to thank you for joining me this evening. Excuse me. It's probably going to be our last deep dive unless I can sneak one in um, somewhere in the summer until September. So I'm glad you're here. And we're going to talk about some salamanders. As I mentioned earlier, I am recording this, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. We're going to get started. All right. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about salamanders. And I want to talk about two of the more common ones you're going to find, even though they're not that easy to find. But they're probably two of the more common ones we have in Arlington County. We don't have a lot. So we're going to learn about talk about the spotted salamander and the eastern redback salamander. And this is the spotted salamander to start us off here. So salamanders have been, it's been very interesting to read some of the things. I think salamanders have been in our culture for a long time. It was interesting to read a quote from Leonardo da Vinci, who wrote of the salamander: "This has no digestive organs and gets no food but from the fire, in which it constantly renews its scaly skin in the fire for virtue." Apparently, that last part was very important. So it was an interesting understanding they had of salamanders a long time ago. Obviously, salamanders don't have scaly skin and they're not in the fire. But I found that quote to be really, really neat. And on the right is a print from a old story. I believe this is gosh, I can't remember if it's a Chinese story with a Japanese translation, but that is the hero of the story in this image here is fighting, in fact, a giant salamander. Which again, nice, scaly, really snake or reptile-like teeth and a tongue. And they've been confused often, unfortunately, but salamanders are not, in fact, reptiles. And just to drive home that point, hopefully, I think we're all on the same page on this, but I want to throw out some. Did we just lose? That was interesting. All right. Just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. We've got a salamander on the right and a lizard on the left. Salamanders are amphibians. They have smooth, moist skin. Lizards are reptiles, and they have scaly skin. It's pretty dry, and you can see the scales there, and even some dry, I think, calcification there. This is an iguana. So very, very different. And again, like I said, I'm hoping we're all on the same page here. This is the quick and easy version of how to explain to somebody else why that is or isn't a salamander or a lizard when you're talking. Because where I work at the Nature Center, we have skinks crawling all over the walls, and people are. I very often hear people say, "Oh, look at the salamander," because of the size of them. I think they might think it's a salamander, but they are in fact lizards. And which brings me to my next photo, which is the other way that's quick and easy to point out is salamanders they have smooth skin, so they have no claws, whereas lizards do have claws, and they're often very easy to point out. And so this is the common five-line skink that you'll find again on around Arlington, certainly on the walls at our nature center. And those are the claws that it uses to climb around on those walls. So now that we've settled that point, let's get into the tree of life here and figure out exactly where we are on this big structure here with our salamanders. So salamanders are chordates. They're in the animal kingdom, and they're chordates, meaning they do have backbones. I have had questions about this before as well. But you see, we've got mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish all represented here in the chordates. And they are, like I said, amphibians. So we got frogs and we got toads. Technically, that is a group together, the Anura. Toads are just frogs that are well adapted for terrestrial life. They've got wartier and thicker skin to help them conserve moisture a little bit more so they can be in drier areas. And then we have our salamanders and our newts. And then this on the right is caecilians. And these are a legless amphibian. They're pretty much restricted to tropical areas. I don't think there's any in North America. They do quite well in rainforest and more tropical, warmer areas. And that would be an interesting topic for another time. We've talked about them a little bit, but just want to throw them in to make sure they were represented here in our picture of amphibians. And then a quick note before I get into salamanders, I used to, let me come back here. So let's see, order is the next one after class. And I used to understand that the order was Caudata. Um, and I can't remember what that stands for, but this was the salamanders. Now it has been, it's used more as a clade, and it represents not just the salamanders, but salamander-like prehistoric amphibians that were more like salamanders and frogs are included in this clade. So when you go from class to order, the caudata is in the middle here, but then the order is actually Urodela, which is the order for salamanders. And we got the two families that we'll be talking about today are the Amstomatidae and the Plethodontidae. The Plethodontids are lungless salamanders because they have no lungs. That one's I think really easy explanation. And the Amstomatids are the mole salamanders because they tend to spend a lot of their life underground, similar to moles. So those names, thankfully, are pretty easy to kind of work through and get an idea of where they come from. So I'm going to talk a lot about the spotted salamander and the eastern redback salamander. I'm assuming you guys can see my cursor, but in case you can't, this black salamander with yellow spots on the upper left, and the dark salamander with the bright red stripe down the back on the upper right is the redbacked. Now below the redback here, this is a two-line salamander, which is also a species you'll find in Arlington. This was actually taken in Barcroft, in the stream there, in 4 Mile Run in the Barcroft Park. And then this one you can find in Virginia here in the bottom left, but it is not one that you typically find around here. And this is a tiger salamander, which are another amphibian that would really be worthy of its own deep dive. They're really an interesting salamander, and they are, if I remember correctly from my days in Colorado, the only salamander in that entire state. They're the only ones that you'll find in the Colorado area. So speaking of how many you'll find in different places, depending on who you read, I get this number 578 from the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, which I think now is DWR instead of DJF. But I got it from their Guide to the Salamanders of Virginia, which is one of their special publications, which I recommend and will reference several more times, along with the picture at the end for you. And they say there's 578 species worldwide. The 760 came from Wikipedia, and I'm more than happy to doubt Wikipedia frequently. But I found this number in a couple other places, which could mean that they were just parroting Wikipedia. But I thought it was interesting because that's a pretty significant difference, 578 to 760. That's almost 30-40% difference in number from 578 to 760. So I don't know if this maybe 760 means they're including another group that the DJF folks weren't, but either way, there's a fair number of salamanders worldwide. What's really interesting is that there's 150 species in North America. I think North America tends to do pretty well when it comes to salamander numbers, and Virginia does as well. 53 species you'll find in Virginia, and that includes 4 endemics, 4 that you won't find anywhere outside of the Commonwealth. And that includes the Peaks of Otter salamander, Shenandoah salamander, Big Level salamander, and the Dixie Cavern salamander. And if those salamanders sound like they're somewhere in the mountains in a remote area, you would probably be correct. They're not very common, and they're pretty much located in one spot. So, speaking of salamanders in places, the largest salamander you'll find in the world is this one on the right. This is the Japanese giant salamander, which can reach lengths of 5 feet, which is just astounding. I mean, if you look at the grass and the dirt here, I think you can get an idea of the scale of that salamander, which is pretty amazing. I was super excited several years ago when they finished the Asia Trail at the zoo because part of the exhibit was to have one of the Japanese giant salamanders. And I think I saw it like once tank, and then I don't think the tank's been working since. But if you know where to look in the reptile house, you can peek through one of the doors and sometimes catch a glimpse of it in its holding tank. And I'm hoping someday they'll fix it. And I don't know, maybe they have already. On the left here is a member of the smallest genus of salamanders in the world. These are Thorius, just like it sounds, the like the god of thunder Thor, IUS, Thorius. And in this genus, you'll find the smallest salamanders in the world. They're called minute salamanders or pygmy salamanders. They're found around I can never pronounce it. Oaxaca, and I'm not going to try. But they're found in that area of Mexico, and again, they're endemic there as well. You don't find them anywhere else. Just recently, within the past, I think, decade, they described 3 more species in that genus, and again, they immediately went on to the endangered species list because of how small they are, how hard it is to find them, and how remote they are. They just don't have an idea on those numbers. And again, just for reference here, this is lots of blades of grass. This is one blade of grass underneath the Thorius. A very, very tiny salamander. Here in Arlington, these are the 6 salamanders you'll find reported on iNaturalist. Again, we're talking about the eastern redback here. A spotted salamander, you can see the eastern redback is easily 4 times more than the next one, the most reported salamander in Arlington, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The northern two-line is here. I think this one is more limited to stream sides. The northern dusky, the red salamander, and the white spotted slimy salamander. Those 3 observations of the white spotted slimy are all the same observer. One of our teen volunteers who spotted one a year or 2 ago over in Long Branch and Glencarlin, and I was pretty excited. And they weren't able to find it again, but we got some good pictures of it, so it's definitely there, which is kind of neat. And then this red salamander pretty much is limited to one small population on private property, which thankfully the owners have not done anything with the area where they live, which is hopefully that'll stick around. And speaking of that red salamander, right there, that is our state salamander for the state of Virginia, the red salamander. Like I said, we are going to focus on the spotted salamander there on the left and the eastern redbacks on the right. When you're IDing salamanders, some of the things that you want to look at as we're looking at these 2 right here, okay, is you want to take a look at the tail shape and length. You want to look at the number of toes, and the number of legs, and you also want to look at the number of toes front and back, because some will have a different number of toes on the front versus the back. You want to look at the number of the costal grooves, and that are these things that look like they're telling you where the ribs are on the salamander, but these are costal grooves, and counting the number of costal grooves can help sometimes make the difference between 2 very similar looking salamanders. Is there an eye stripe present or not? The shape of the head and the snout can be very important. Any background color and pattern. Obviously, the spots here are what really help you identify the spotted salamander. And then is the body elongated or is it more robust? You tend to find this robustness more with critters like the mole salamanders, versus you got these elongated ones like these are the plethodontids. The neat thing about these plethodontids is it's thought that they evolved in the Shenandoah Mountains. That's where you originally started to find these salamanders, and so that's why you have some of these endemics like the 4 I mentioned, which are really, really specific to a very small area, as opposed to the eastern redback salamander, which has done a really good job of spreading out throughout the eastern U.S. And is often one of the most common salamanders and one of the most common organisms in certain forests. Um, the spotted salamander is a dark color. You got these yellow spots. The young spotteds sometimes don't develop those spots right away, and so they might look very similar to this, but not have the full yellow coloration yet. This one in the middle here on the right, when you look at the red backs here, you can see this one is obviously the namesake salamander with the red back. To the left, where it's all dark and there's no red, this is often called the leadback salamander to the coloration, and you'll even find some with a yellow stripe down the middle instead of a red. So 3 different color variations you can see with those redback salamanders. They both share a very similar place to live. They both prefer to be fossorial under the ground. Spotted salamanders very much so. A lot of the redback salamanders are pretty easy to find I shouldn't say are easy to find, can be found if you dig through leaf litter or look under logs and rocks at the right time of year. They tend to be inactive during the summer. but you'll find them in spring and in fall, but less so in the summer. And I believe they estivate, but it's not as easy to find, and they might move down deeper too, where they can stay moist longer. As lungless salamanders, they obviously don't breathe with lungs; they breathe through their skin and the lining of their mouth. So, making sure that they're able to stay moist so that so oxygen can pass across their skin and the membrane in their mouth is really, really important. So we are not going to talk about frogs, but one of the things I always like to, if you've done a few of these with me, I always like to talk about what we learn in school, or what is commonly, trumpeted as far as the natural world. And a lot of times there's one critter that really catches people's attention that gets talked about a lot, or is even assumed to be the standard for all these other critters. So, when you talk about amphibians, a lot of times the first thing people think about are frogs, or frogs and toads. And I think, through school and a lot of activities, people tend to have a fairly decent grasp of frog development and what it means. One of the other reasons I think that frogs get paid so much attention to, and again, I will not argue with somebody if they think a frog is cute, but one of the things that I think really captures the attention of people is they make a lot of noise. Frogs have a mating ritual that includes the males calling and the females responding. That captures your attention. You're aware that it's happening. You can't ignore this. So all these frogs march into your pond. They make a loud noise for a couple weeks and then they disappear. And typically, unless you didn't go outside that entire time and kept all your windows shut, it happened. Whereas when these other salamanders move in, you don't know that they're there at all. So the frogs move in, they form this amplexus where they uh, uh, eggs are fertilized externally. So the male grabs the female in amplexus. He will push and trying to think of a good word. Try to influence the female to release the eggs. When she releases the eggs, he releases the sperm, and so those openings are right next to each other. So that is trying to maximize the number of eggs that get fertilized. Okay, and this is the end product. This is something I think most people are really familiar with. These big clumps of anchored but floating egg masses that you find in ponds. This is one that was laid very, probably pretty close to when before this picture was taken. And these other ones have had a chance to absorb water and expand, and so they're much larger. This um, compactness of the eggs when they initially come out is so that the female doesn't have to be massive and huge to carry all those eggs inside of her. Okay. And again, frogs don't follow that plan either. Upper left is Fleischmann's glass frog. It says tree frog, which obviously is really good camouflage. And they, attach their eggs to a leaf. Upper right is I think it's a gray foam frog. I don't remember where, it might be Africa, but they can't always depend on finding a body of water. So their eggs are in this foam nest that they protect, or that they put the eggs in. I don't know if they protect it or not, but they put the eggs in there, and then eventually they will hatch out of here. This is Darwin's frog in the bottom right, and it participates in, I think it's called gastric or gular brooding. Essentially, it broods in its mouth. Keeps the young in its mouth, and then the midwife toad here on the left is carrying its eggs with it near its posterior. So these frogs didn't follow the rules either, but generally, come back here, these frogs have to go find the water. Even tree frogs, which spend most of their life up in trees, come down to the water in order to lay eggs. The wood frogs, which spend their life similar to spotted salamanders and eastern redback salamanders, under logs and rocks and leaf litter in the forest, come to the pond to mate. So, they're looking for a vernal pool like this. This is a pool that is nice and wet in the spring. You can see that vibrant spring green there in the surrounding plants. But by mid to late summer, typically these kind of ponds dry up. Makes them ideal for um, reproducing amphibians, because it's a great nursery because there's no fish in it. Fish can't live in a pond when it doesn't have water for half the year. So that reduces the predator. It's also an interesting idea that it reduces other predators too, such as the predators that come to eat the fish, which might also have a tadpole snack or two as well. So these vernal pools are really, really important. Now, salamanders go to these ponds too. but they show up really quietly. They don't make a lot of fuss about themselves or a lot of noise. They're very polite in that regard, and you just don't always notice that they're there. And they might not stay as long either. I think sometimes, it's only one night, maybe 2 to 3 nights at most, and the salamanders have done what they needed to do and they leave. So besides um, showing up quietly, not making any noise, they don't stay very long either. So you'll have that week and a half to 2 weeks when the wood frogs show up in late February into early March, and a lot of times, very near around there is when the salamanders come in, but you don't really notice. All of a sudden, one morning you might find some egg masses, or if your water's really clear, you might notice another structure, which we'll talk about in a second. Um, but again, the frogs take up a lot of attention and make a lot of commotion because they're on the surface. They're frantic. They're constantly calling, and so a lot of these times these don't get noticed. When I worked up in Cleveland, we also had Jefferson salamanders that came in as well to the vernal pools up there. We have Jefferson salamanders here in Virginia, but you got to go west to find those. I think up in the mountains more. We don't have them in this part of um, Northern Virginia. So what one thing that salamanders do differently, you don't see salamanders in the hug typically like the frogs. And again, I'm sure there's exceptions. But what the salamanders are going to try to do is the male's going to try to convince the female through some dancing, maybe even some pheromones, even through some nudging and elbow rubbing to pick up its spermatophore. So this little packet right here on this leaf stem right here, this is a spermatophore of a spotted salamander, and that spotted salamander male will deposit that and then try to convince the female that this is what she wants. And so you'll have this massive um, number of salamanders leaving these in. So the next morning, a lot of times what you'll see is these little packets littered all over the bottom of the pond. And that's evidence that they've been there. Because again, during the day, they're going to be, they might come out of the pond and hide in the leaf litter, or they're going to hide in if there's a leaf litter in that pond. Like this was the pond. I think this is when I worked at Reston. In this pond, we had a lot of leaves that would fall in from the trees, and so they would just hide under all those leaves, and you'd never see them during the day unless you dug around in the leaves in the bottom of the water. And the water was cold, and I tended not to do that. But you would find a lot of these left over. And again, by the time you find these, they might have even left the pond because mating was pretty much over. So what the males really stop. What the male's really trying to do is get that female to bend over and pick up. Now, salamanders have one opening called a cloaca, and that's the end of their gastrointestinal tract. That is for the elimination of wastes, both obviously one and two, and it's also a reproductive opening. So the male is hoping that the female will crouch over this and pick it up with her cloaca, and that's how fertilization occurs. So it actually occurs internally um, through this the transfer of the spermatophore packet, which the male again deposits on a leaf, and then the female picks up. And you get these really, really neat looking little eggs. This is, I think, early on, right after it was probably the next day after the eggs were fertilized. And again, you'll notice not the big numbers like in frogs. And there's a reason for that that I'll mention in a little bit here. You'll start to notice that there is a envelope around um, the eggs that are keeping it together. You can kind of see a little bit of a hint of it there, but this one got covered in dust. So it's obviously much more obvious. What happens later on, and this is really neat, is you'll get this, it'll become opaque and cloudy. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean there's a fungus or anything. What it does mean is there's an algae. There's a kind of algae, I think it's a green algae that grows in there. And what's really neat is this green algae through photosynthesis produces a lot of oxygen, and that extra oxygen essentially produces a small microenvironment that is very, very oxygen rich and allows the embryos to keep developing in an oxygen rich environment, even if the rest of this pond happens to go um, oxygen low or even anoxic. They're still going to get this get the amount of oxygen they need for the photosynthesis happening from these algae, which is really cool. It's this symbiosis. It benefits the salamander embryos, but then I believe the structure helps benefit the algae, although it doesn't last forever for the algae, but still it's a benefit to both organisms. And inside those eggs, we've got our little salamanders growing. If you look really closely at the two in the center, hopefully you can see not just the head and body of the salamander, but you can also see those little feathery gills that are developing there as well. But you won't see any legs. They hatch and they're legless. Excuse me. It's very brief. I think it only lasts for a day or so. But they do hatch. Excuse me. They do hatch, and they are wow. And they are initially legless, but their legs pop out pretty quick. Here's a nice closer look. This is again a spotted salamander. You can see the little embryo there. And those are my fingers. Not that all of you have the dimensions of my finger, memorized, but that should give you a rough idea of how tiny these eggs are. And again, then how even tinier that embryo is when they hatch. Don't go calling that newly hatched larval salamander cute. These are vicious, vicious predators. All right, maybe not vicious, but they are certainly predators. Unlike tadpoles, these guys are not eating plant material. They are catching and eating other organisms. And it's one of the things that makes salamanders much harder to rear than tadpoles. So you see, and then they've got this nice mane of feathery gills. You can see it here. I tried to give you 3 different images here to get that point across. This is obviously one that's in a little collection cup. This is a tub we were using for a program, and then this one is in situ in the Gulf Branch pond. But these feathery gills here at their neck are a larval structure that will disappear when they become adults. But that is what they're breathing with right now while they're underwater, using these gills to breathe through the water. And again, predators. And so you don't get the numbers of salamanders in a pond like you would with the frogs, because having a higher number of predators just means they're probably eventually going to eat each other. So you're wasting your energy producing as many eggs. So if you can produce probably a higher quality eggs in lower number, that's good. But and these guys will hatch. And again, they will eat smaller tadpoles, so they'll often share spaces with wood frog tadpoles and other amphibians. And so they don't want to, this is one of the predators you have to worry about. And unfortunately, this isn't one you can choose a pool that doesn't have, because they're using the same vernal pools as the other critters that are trying to avoid the fish predators. But again, they're something that you can see in these ponds, but not nearly as common as a tadpole. If you around our pond between like April, May, and June, early June, and you dip a net in, it's almost hard not to get a tadpole in the net, but you got to work a lot harder to find. Oh, why does it keep doing that? Oh, somebody's got their bird and microphone going there. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Back in here. So they got these gills, and then this is how they're going to live. And again, I feel like it's only a few weeks that they're in there before they'll come out as small adult salamanders. Because again, if they're using a vernal pool, they know they can't stay there very long. And so when they're using that vernal pool, you got to plan for a quick development. That's why when wood frogs come out of the pond, they're so small. They can't be big in the small time they got. So they got to, if they're going to be quick, then they're going to come out as smaller frogs, much smaller than the adults. And it's going to take a few years to catch up once they're out of the pond. But again, the advantage is you don't have all those as many predators in these vernal pools. And even though those toes look a little pointy, there's no claws on them because these are salamanders. And then again, like I said, just a reminder, a lot of times they'll share the same space. This salamander is not going to eat that tadpole, because the tadpole's definitely large, and this salamander's kind of looking for stuff that can swallow and not really eat in little pieces. But again, you can see the feathery gills here. Tadpoles have gills too. They're just internal. And they have, their back legs come in and then their front legs, where the salamanders have their all four legs pretty quickly early on in development. And salamanders are carnivores, and tadpoles tend to be herbivores, maybe detritivores. They'll certainly eat some dead stuff. They don't really actively go after other animal food. So one of the things that has to happen, you can see that definitely looks like a salamander. This kind of looks like this, round shape. It doesn't really look like a frog. When you have those tadpoles going through that metamorphosis, and they begin to look more and more frog-like, that's because among many other changes that are occurring in that tadpole's body to become a frog, one of those changes is their whole jaw is changing to become a carnivore. Their gut changes too. The length of their gut, I think, actually shortens, because they don't need that length of gut that they needed as an herbivore, as a tadpole. Um, there aren't as many of those types of changes that have to occur for the salamander, because it's already a carnivore. It's already a predator, and so its head structure already looks like it's going to as an adult because of that. So they don't have that kind of change going on like uh, the tadpoles here. So let's talk about the redback here. This is the leadback, or the darker version. Um, Redback salamanders. Okay, so we talked about all these frogs that go to the water, except for some that don't. We talked about how the spotted salamander comes back to the vernal pools to lay its eggs. Redback salamanders don't have time for that. They don't bother with returning to the water. They're one of the few salamander species that don't go back to the water to reproduce. I think a lot of the lungless salamander species, the plethodonids, don't do that. So they will find a mate uh, on land. And again, there's no calling, like frogs. It's really obvious for us that, like, there's a bunch of frogs out in the pond yelling, "Hey, hey, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me." With salamanders, it's much more subtle. And in this case, when they're not in the water, what redback salamanders do is the females will leave release pheromones for the males to find them. And in some species, the males will even have a brief development of a structure called nasal cirri. Okay, this is from the Salamander Guide. Oh, that got flipped around. Oh, yeah. Anyways, um, uh, the nasal cirri, and this helps them to detect those pheromones. This is a cave salamander, not a species we have around here, but I just got this picture out of here directly, and so I wanted to make sure I credited the book, but that you were able to see what I'm talking about with these nasal structures. And a lot of times, what was interesting, one of the things I read is they can be monogamous, where the male and the female stay together through the breeding period. What was interesting is, they maintain territories throughout the year, these redback salamanders, and they actually have territories. They put down scents and they actively defend them. And what they found is, some males will be very permissive to allow females to come in and hang out in their area, even as they vigorously defend it against other males. And I didn't see that they said that it was actually true, but there is some evidence that those males are anticipating or are hoping to mate with that female, and it's more likely that female will return because it's already a safe space. And so being territorial with other males, but being more permissive to allow a female or two to hang out in your territory might lead to a greater reproductive success later on for the redbacks. So there's your little bit of salamander politics for the day. So we have, if we're a male redback, we have followed the pheromones to found a female. And then you've got to do the same thing if you're the redback. You've got to cajole, you've got to kind of nudge, you want to encourage that female through some courtship displays to pick up your spermatophore, so that the fertilization can occur, so then you can lay these eggs. Redback salamanders actually hang out and are their eggs. They're at least until the eggs hatch. So that's really neat. Best log I ever rolled over. Long time ago, I got to go to Audubon camp at Connecticut and rolled over a log. And on one end was an eastern redback salamander wrapped around its clutch of eggs. And at the other end of the log was a big centipede with about 40 or 50 younger centipedes all wrapped in a ball around it. And I thought at that moment I should never roll a log again because I'll never see anything that cool. So you definitely find these, and again, they're so common in our forests. I was reading some really neat numbers here. Um, Give me a second here because I marked the page because I knew I wouldn't remember the number on my own. They are probably the most abundant salamander in Virginia, and in many forests where you'll find them. Uh, it says in some eastern U.S. forests, there may be more than 2,000 redback salamanders inhabiting about 2.5 acres or 1 hectare. Okay. Another thing that I read said that in some of these forests, you can find 3 of these redback salamanders per square meter, which translates, if you go up to 1 square kilometer, about 3 million salamanders. So there are forests where these salamanders, the numbers of these salamanders are, their biomass exceeds that of all the birds and mammals combined. It's just incredible. And again, you rarely see them, but they're one of the most numerous organisms in these forests. So worrying about this guy finding this gal, um, really isn't that hard. You think about how hard it is for, let's say, box turtles to find mates, and one of their adaptations is that they can mate much later in life than humans can, because who knows how often they'll encounter a female, or the male will encounter a receptive female to be able to mate. And so these guys don't seem to have that problem because there are a ton of them out in the woods. And the other thing that's really neat is you can't have a larval stage with no legs if you're on land and you're not in water. So they go through something called direct development. And by the time that this salamander hatches out of the eggs, it has 4 legs and it is ready to move on. They're not sexually mature necessarily. They have still some development, but they're essentially a tiny salamander that are ready to go. And just in case you're not paying attention, because I didn't initially when I saw this image, this is a dime, not a quarter. I think of the standard being like a quarter to put down, but this is actually a dime, and it looks like you could probably fit another half dozen of these little eastern redback salamander hatchlings um, onto that dime. So it's really, uh, again, incredible, these adaptations that they have for living on land, so they don't have to return to the water, even though obviously being amphibians, that's kind of what's implied in their name. I just want to make a note. One of the others you'll find in the area, though I don't think you see them often in Arlington, are these eastern red spotted newts, and they have a larval stage that is, that after they hatch out of the egg that lives in the water, and then they have a second larval stage that is terrestrial, and that is this one here that you'll see, and they advertise very clearly that they are distasteful, and not something that you want to go, not something you want to go eating if you are a potential predator. So why all the fuss? Why am I bothering you guys with all this talk about salamanders? Well, one of the neat things about salamanders is what they eat and what that has an impact on. Salamanders often eat critters like this. This is one of the favorite foods of redback salamanders. These are eastern, I think it's subterranean termites. Reticulothermes is the name of the genus. They're really neat critters, and they are, again, I think these can get in your home. Obviously, these are not. These are under a log, and they are, an important part of the forest out there as far as breaking down old wood and returning it to the soil on that whole circle of life. And so that's really really important. Um, but all that activity, whether you're a termite or whether you're some of these other invertebrates, when you are ripping and tearing and pulling apart pieces of um, plants, pieces, leaves, when you're tearing that up, you're releasing carbon directly into the air, and so that is, can be a form of carbon loading. Certainly not as big or as obvious as some forms that we do as humans. But when you're a small salamander and you're eating these organisms before they can either release the carbon that they've consumed or cut any more, you're actually helping reduce some of that carbon loading. So one of the things that they talked about is that action by salamanders of keeping those numbers low actually helps reduce carbon, some of the carbon loading that happens naturally. So they are these tiny, small little um, climate change heroes, which I think is really, really cool. The other thing that they do that is also very similar is, because their numbers are so big. And again, remember, I was talking like, oh, yeah, and I was talking like 3 million in a square kilometer. Can make their activities very influential in the forest. And what they do is just really not just influential but consequential. That if if they're there versus not, and what can happen is another thing they do is they often feed on many different invertebrates, from flies to termites to small spiders to many different critters. And a lot of these invertebrates tend to feed on fungus, and fungus breaks down dead organic matter as well, and helps convert it back into the soil for nutrient cycling. And that fungus does that is very, very important. The numbers of salamanders that are eating critters that eat the fungus help the fungus do its job. There are some theories that if we were to not if we were to lose these salamanders, there's a very real chance that nutrient cycling could slow or even stop in some of these forests, because without the salamanders consuming the fungivores, eating these critters that are eating fungus, that we would have a reduction in fungus and a slowdown or even stoppage of decomposition in some of these forests, which is just, I read that and I still have a hard time comprehending that, but that was just a really interesting idea that I want to share there. And so again, these are tiny critters. These are critters that many of us don't realize are out there, let alone out there in these numbers, and yet they're having this major impact on these ecosystems. And so it's important not just to understand that, but to keep that in mind whenever you manage these areas, that you want to make sure you're managing an area well for these critters too, because they're obviously having a really significant impact on the ecosystems. So if you want to help your salamanders, there's a couple of really easy ways. One is, and this is pretty obvious, it's the easiest thing to say and probably in some ways the hardest thing to do, is keep those forests around. This is the habitat that they need. Obviously, they're significantly helping in these forests, so that's a pretty big deal. So you want to make sure that whenever possible, if we can save these tracts of land and keep them undisturbed, it's going to help the salamander populations. There are some other more direct things. Remember those spotted salamanders that were migrating to ponds? Don't buy these kinds of salamanders from pet stores. Whenever you can educate somebody, by all means. I remember this is, um, as a young naturalist, one of my first um, experiences with people really, with the phrase, people really do that. This was a trap that was found in one of our vernal pools, and as you can see, it was full of spotted salamanders. And remember, if they're only in there for one night or 1 to 3 nights, and they're getting removed here before they can reproduce, you're not just removing animals from the population, but you're removing reproduction. You're removing the next potential, a portion of the next potential generation as well. And so this could have been really harmful. And thankfully, whoever found this, was able to took a picture and then released them back into the vernal pool. So hopefully they were able to successfully mate and contribute. But this was also, and this was in a park. It's always amazing. That's the other thing that's always amazing to me is, who would do this in a park and think that that was okay and acceptable. And chances are, it might have been somebody who was going to sell them for pets or for pet food, which is a really horrible thing to do because there's so many other options out there. But someone would probably try to make a quick buck. So, be a voice for these critters, but also, if you see something like this happen, and try to step in or educate or whatever you can, but just try to prevent these kind of things from happening, because taking the critters right when they're about to reproduce is really, really hard on the population. And finally, reusable chopsticks. This has just always been one of my favorite conservation efforts that I came across, was this idea of chopsticks for salamanders. And again, if you look at the first bullet here and the small one here, 3.8 million trees are felled each year to supply timber for the disposable chopsticks industry. That is a really specific use, and that is a lot of trees. And I have my own chopsticks. I did that. I feel like they were selling some at one time or another, but uh, you know, try not to, use disposable wooden products if possible, because those have to come from somewhere. It tends to be forests, and the more reusable things we can use, like chopsticks, the more we can help organisms that depend on these forests and live in these forests. Um, and by the way, I don't know how many of you know or remember Matt Neff, but he worked at the Nature Center for a little while, Long Branch, before moving on to the zoo, and he does a lot of really neat stuff with salamanders. And I think he was instrumental in the nice salamander exhibit they have at the National Zoo in the Reptile House, which is really worth a look. So I think that is all I. Oh yeah, and this is the book, A Guide to the Salamanders of Virginia. I want to make sure I mention that. I'm not in any way trying to plug it, but they have several of these books for the herps around the state, and they are fantabulous. I really enjoy them, and I recommend at least picking one up if you don't want to buy one, but at least page thumbing through them. They're a really nice job. And again, the information is specific to Virginia, which is really helpful and really good. And that is the tiger salamander there. And again, like I said, we don't have them around here, but we do have them in Virginia, which is really neat. Our largest salamanders here in Virginia are the hellbender and the amphiuma, depending on which way you want to measure large. Amphiuma is the longest, and the hellbender is the biggest. They can weigh up to 4 pounds, which I can't imagine a salamander that weighs close to a sack of sugar. That's just really amazing to me. So thank you for joining me. And if anybody has any questions, I'm going to end the slideshow and see if I can answer some questions.
And I have a question for you. It's Connie here.
Hi, Connie.
Yeah, explain to me the difference. You mentioned the red salamander, and we have a newt. A newt is not a red salamander.
No, so the newt is, let me give you the appropriate name here, make sure I got it right. Red spotted newt.
Right.
And the red salamander, yeah, they look very different. The newt is in that terrestrial larval stage, they're orange with red spots. But generally they're not that bright as adults. They're still pretty neat looking, but I'm trying to see if I can find a picture here in the book.
I'm sure I've seen newts, but I don't think I've ever seen a red salamander. So
yeah, and again, locally they're very rare. Like I said, there's that one population. And I want to think, oh, you know what? Let me look back at that. So they are a seasonal wetland salamander, and the red salamander is considered a forest terrestrial salamander. My guess is they look stocky, and I'm wondering if that red salamander might have. Did I miss it? If they might be a mole salamander.
But do
I can't tell from the name.
We have the newts in northern Virginia.
That's a really good question. It was funny that you say that because I pulled up Alonzo's page on the salamanders in the area, and he does not have them listed for Arlington and Fairfax County. But in Virginia, we do have the newts. I just don't know if they're in northern Virginia. Here, hold
on. Thank you.
That's okay.
Answers what I was
looking. Yeah, like I said, this book is great because it has the thing. So, there you go. I don't know if you can see this. Come in close, but it says they're all the way up in Northern Virginia. And again, needing having an aquatic stage and having a terrestrial stage, there might not be the right kind of habitat requirements here in the county. Trying to think where the last time I saw an eft where I was. I think I was out in Loudoun County. I don't know that we have around here. I think there might be too much development in Arlington. It's possible maybe in some spots in Fairfax, but I think you got to get a little bit further away from all of this in order to do it. Growing up, one of our neighbors had a pond that was just rotten with them, and it was so cool to me. Just constantly could find newts in that pond. I always thought that was really cool. Anybody else have a question?
So Ken, Miss Melanie, hi.
Sure.
Yeah, so you've got salamanders at Gulf Branch, because I've seen them.
Yes, yeah. But
that one time I met.
We have
with his sons, and they were picking them up. They turned over a log over by the river, and they had two in their hands, and they were handling them. And I told them not to do that. I told them that they belonged back in the forest. I think they were going to take them home.
And they're hard to feed. I mean, you really got to get the right kind of food, and then hopefully it's the food that they like. Like one of the neat things that I've seen that you can buy, there's no red spotted newts in Arlington, Natchez. Especially the F's can be really easy to spot because they're meant to be colored that way. One of the things that I always tell kids when I'm talking to amphibians, especially salamanders and frogs, is that handling them with your hands can be really detrimental to them because, like the redback, they breathe through their skin. So if you damage or do anything to their skin that reduces their ability to absorb oxygen, you're reducing their ability to respirate, which can be deadly. And if you've got anything on your hand, from hand sanitizer to sunscreen to bug spray, soap, lotion, any of that stuff is not a good mix for these salamanders to breathe. It's just not a good idea. So whenever possible, I try not to handle them with my hands unless there's like some water or something that I can dip my hand in, like, and again, not a water bottle, but like, pond water or something where I can get it on my hand. So there's, hopefully that, instead of even the natural oils I think on our hands are not the best thing for them either, because we have different types of skin. So, but yeah, in Gulf Branch, we have spotted salamanders that come into the pond and breed every year, and we have the eastern redbacks, which are at the right time of year pretty easy to find if you turn over a couple logs or rocks, or look through the leaf litter. But that's about it. I think they used to find marbled salamanders before, and we haven't seen that in a while. And I think Jen Souls, who I think a lot of you know and used to be a natural, she's now with Natural Resources. She swears she's found the two-line salamander in the stream before, but and again, she was here longer than me. I haven't. The only ones I've been able to find is the spotted and the redback. So we do have them in Gulf Branch, and we have a few, like again, those 6 species that are named, but not a lot of salamanders around here. But if you really like salamanders, heading out to somewhere like Shenandoah is a kind of a salamander paradise. There's a lot of different salamanders you can find out there.
Yeah, Wolf Gap that got it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Anyone else with a question about salamanders, meaning of life? I can't really help you with the meaning of life, but I could do
Hey,
salamanders.
Ken, do you know anything about the lore of salamanders? Because at the Chateau de Blois in France, France is the first castle. It's a hunting castle. There's a
Okay.
salamander in the stained glass window. There's salamanders as a
Oh,
symbol. Do you know anything
yeah.
about that?
I don't know a thing about that. No. And
Yeah,
again,
I'm curious why
that
salamanders.
yeah, no, that's okay. As I mentioned earlier, the salamanders had that lore of being living in fire, and I don't know enough about that to even speak to like how that idea came from. But the word salamander comes from the Middle English word salamandre. So it's just the last 2 letters reversed, which means lives in fire. But again, I don't know, where that came from. But that was, something that a lot of people quote knew about back then. Obviously, the fire thing, and so that might be where that stained glass comes from.
Okay.
Sure. And again, North America is a pretty good salamander spot. We got a pretty rich diversity here, and I think one of the things I read is that the northern hemisphere tends to be better than the southern hemisphere, and there's not. It's not. I don't think that there's no, but salamanders aren't really a tropical species. They tend to do really well in the whole Arctic regions. Um, so, well, if there's no other questions, I'm going to thank you all for coming tonight and joining me. And like I said, I don't have any plans right now to do any. Ooh, that was interesting. I don't have any plans right now to do any deep dives over the summer because we didn't schedule stuff because of camp. But I might try to sneak one in. And if I do, I would send it out to Armin, and I would send a quick email thing out to pass registrants to let you know. So and I'll have a recording ready at some point as well too. So um thanks everyone for joining me, and have a delightful one, and I hope you get to hear one last cicada before they're all gone.
Thanks, Ken.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for coming.